Wow, tons of big news today. So we got the Fed and we got Putin. We got Powell and we got Pooty Poot. I guess Putin came first, so we'll talk about that, and then we'll move into the Fed. Putin announced, sort of in the wake of the announcements of these 4 oblasts in Ukraine, having referendums this coming weekend to join Russia, Putin announced, as I expected, an escalation of the war on Russia's, on Russia's side. He's going to be calling up 300,000 reservists. So that's the big news there. They are going to be expanding their war efforts there. Now, people are saying that he threatened to use nuclear weapons. I did not hear that at all. I watched the clip, and I don't speak Russian, but I can read subtitles, and the subtitles never have the word nuclear appear anywhere. All he said was basically what I've said for quite a while, which is that the Ruskies have been holding back on a bit of their military power. They have more military might that they can unleash if they want to in Ukraine, and I thought that them orchestrating these referendums to join Russia in these 4 oblasts was a sign that they were going to escalate militarily and use perhaps more troops, bigger bombs, that sort of stuff. But people jumped and said that Putin was threatening nuclear war. And he said, so all the headlines were written, not in quotes, Putin threatens to use nuclear weapons, quote, this is not a bluff. So yes, he did say this is not a bluff, at least in the subtitled version of the video that I saw. But he did not say he was going to use nuclear weapons. There's a lot of escalation that he can do before they get to nuclear weapons. But if you are buying into the narrative that Russia has been fighting, with its full might from the beginning, and that they've just been meeting, such extreme, Ukrainian resistance, and that the Ruski army is completely at a loss of how to advance in Ukraine, well, then the only thing they have left to escalate, is the use of nuclear weapons. So it's funny how a fake narrative builds on itself and morphs into another fake narrative. The fake narrative of the Ruskies are back on their heels. The front line has collapsed. They're being overrun. Zelensky will be in Moscow by the end of the week. That fake narrative turns into, well, obviously, if Putin is saying he's going to escalate from here, that means he's going to use nukes. And so I do not think that Russia will be using nuclear weapons. They didn't even use nuclear weapons, back in Afghanistan, a war that they did end up losing in the 80s. They did not use nukes back then. I don't anticipate them using nukes now, for the simple reason that no matter what happens from, in the future in Ukraine, I can't, predict how the course of the war is going to go, how much longer it's going to go on. But I guarantee you that the Ukrainians are not going to be a serious threat to Russian territory. If the Ruskies have decided that these 4 oblasts are going to be Russian territory, I think that the Ruskies are prepared to defend them. I mean, what would be the point in annexing somewhere and then going and nuking the place? I mean, would that really look good for Russia if they nuked Russia? Especially when they were not under any serious threat to begin with? So yes, I think that the narrative, as per usual, is nonsensical. But we certainly will be seeing an escalation. The Ruskies will be ramping things up. I don't know exactly what that looks like. I don't know if this means that they're going to open up new fronts, if they're just going to shore up and try and, consolidate in these 4 oblasts. That I would assume that's going to be their primary objective. And once they're done with that, I don't know, what their plans are as far as moving forward. I would imagine, though, that at the end of the day, they're going to try and get at least to Odessa and Kharkov. Putin referenced Novorossiya, which was in his speech, which I put Novorossiya in my thumbnail yesterday. Novorossiya ? Well, Putin answered that question. He said, yep, Novorossiya, which, from what I understand, would include Odessa. For those of you who don't know, Novorossiya means New Russia, and it was essentially the territories of the Russian Empire that I believe were added by Catherine the Great So it would be all the stuff, kind of down there around the Black Sea. All the Novorossiya basically would mean the parts of Ukraine that Russia would want to control. So, moving on to the Fed's announcement, they hiked rates by another 75 basis points, and Powell is basically in whatever it takes mode at this point. He was asked that flat out today, hey, because I think it was Zero Hedge said that Powell set a new record today for amount of times the word pain has been uttered during a Fed press conference, and I would imagine that's the case. He did say pain a lot. Jerome Painwell is probably a decent nickname for him at this point. I listened to the whole thing, as I usually try to do, especially on important days like this, and I don't want to quite say he was Volcker-esque, because Powell he doesn't have the persona. I don't think we'll ever see a Fed chairman like Paul Volcker, just sort of sitting there chomping on a cigar with those big, glasses and his, bright white hair just sort of staring at you and say, nope, we're going to hike again. But Powell clearly was trying to exude a little bit of that bravado. He was definitely trying to channel that, I think, because he was fairly firm in saying the goal is to get inflation down to 2%. And so the beatings will continue until this spike in inflation has subsided. And honestly, I'm glad to hear it. It's the bare minimum that we should expect from the Fed. If I don't think that 2% inflation is good. I think that any inflation is bad. In fact, I want deflation. I want goods to be getting cheaper because that means that people are getting richer. That's what happened during the Industrial Revolution in the United States. The wealth of ordinary people skyrocketed because all of a sudden all these goods that had to be, handmade and things and were very scarce and expensive became cheap and plentiful. And so prices went through the floor. You just think about, you had transportation, you had these giant ships, you had railroads, we had factories, the cotton gin, textile machines, all of this made basic, parts of life, clothing, transportation, all of this became so much cheaper. That, to me, is a good economy. A good economy is not the cost of living goes up by 2% every year. Every year you get 2% poorer, and you have to constantly be fighting to try and get a promotion, to try and make more money, and that's all your life would be spent about. It's not just making enough money, because it's never enough money. You have to focus on constantly making more and more money. That's the kind of society that the Fed has created with their inflation targets. And I think that is sick and twisted, and I wish more people saw things that way, but most people just don't care. They go right along with it, and then when they decide, you know what, I don't like this, they just say, you know what, how about full communism? And that, of course, is a non-starter, so the economic malcontents go nowhere. And thus the system is able to perpetuate itself, and these people stay in power. But that's a discussion for another day. Today, Powell is being okay. He's, like I said, it's as good as I can expect a Fed chairman to be. Inflation needs to come down. And yes, there are supply side factors. I know that just as well as anybody. But you can still deal with supply side price increases by monkey hammering demand. And certainly asset prices, real estate prices, stock prices, bond prices, that's not a supply side problem. There is no shortage of these things. This idea that we have a housing shortage is absurd. We're building tons of housing every year, and the population is not increasing. So we should not be seeing housing prices rise nationally. Yes, you could say, oh, well, we might have a housing shortage in certain areas. Well, if that's the case, if it's because of people moving from one part of the country to another part of the country, well, then prices in the parts of the country that's losing population should fall just as much as prices are rising in the parts of the country that people are moving to. That's not the case. Prices are going up everywhere pretty much, although that's starting to change. It's leveled off because of the Fed's hikes, but it should Before this, it was going up pretty much everywhere, just at different rates. In a place like Florida, prices were going up much, much faster than in other parts of the country, but everywhere pretty much was up. And so Powell, for the first time that I've heard, maybe said in the past, he came out pretty clearly and said, this needs to change. The housing market is absurd. This idea that it's normal for someone to put a house on the market and day one it's sold for 10% over asking price or more by sight unseen. That's not normal. It can never be normal, and the housing market needs to go through a correction, he said. Now, a correction normally is like 10%. That's silly. I think that housing prices need to fall by like 50%, and that's just looking at long-term averages. To revert to the mean, there needs to be a big crash. The housing bubble this time, and by bubble I mean prices above the long-term average adjusted for inflation. There's a bigger bubble this time than there was back in 2006. So if the bubble's bigger this time, the crash has to be bigger because we need to revert to the mean. And again, mean reversion does not mean housing gets cheap. Mean reversion means housing prices go back to normal. The housing prices of today are not normal. The housing prices of 2012 were normal. For the last 10 years, housing prices have gone straight up. No wonder we have a homelessness problem. We don't have a shortage of houses. It's ridiculous. We have an excess of buying power. It's just been pure price inflation. And that is something that the Fed can fix. Now, the dot plot, which is the prediction of where Fed funds will be in later dates, in the opinion of different members of the Board of Governors, the median dot, which is kind of like their aggregate prediction, is about 4.4%, I think. And that's by the end of this year, meaning that we're at what? We're at 3.25 right now. That's the new Fed funds rate. 4.4 would mean that, or maybe it was 4.55. Can't remember now. Anyway, it was somewhere in there. That means that we're going to get another 75 basis point hike, get us up to 4%, and then I guess a 50 basis point hike. That seems to be the way that the Fed is leaning right now, but it seems at this point pretty certain next month we're going to get another 75 basis point hike. And so we're nearing that 5% that the Fed was at back in the mid-2000s that led to the 2008 crash. Fed funds, however, is still well below inflation, and they did not have this inflation problem back in the mid-2000s. So as of now, it seems like Fed funds is going to get to mid-4s, so maybe 4.5%, 4.25%. That seems pretty likely at this point. And then it's going to stay there, if not go higher, until inflation falls back down to 2%. At which point I would be surprised if the Fed didn't cut all the way back down to zero, because once inflation comes back down, we will be in a deep depression. I mean, we've got winter coming for Europe. It's not just the U.S. you have to worry about. It's the whole global dollar economy. And the Fed has accepted that there's going to be pain. The pain will continue until inflation gets back down to 2%. And then after that, there's going to be pain because, you can't just unbake the cake or you can't unpop the bubble. The Fed has made it clear that, well, they're saying this. I have to hesitate because, the idea that Powell wants to pop the bubble it's still hard to swallow. But from what he's saying, his plan is to pop the bubble, and he's prepared for that. And he's acting like, oh, okay, well, that's, everything will be fine. We're just going to, pop the inflation bubble. But we all know it's not going to be fine. Popping the bubble will cause a big crash in the economy, and cutting rates back down to zero is not going to fix that, just like it didn't fix it back in 2008. And by every metric that I've seen, we've got a bigger bubble this time, which means the crash, the pop, should be that much more painful. and therefore the recovery that much more difficult. And so doing the exact same thing that the Fed did back in 2008, cutting from, back then they cut from 5% down to 0 and then did QE and all that nonsense, going from 4.5% down to 0 and doing all that nonsense. We're in for the same crap. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.